Welcome back to another episode of We Were Children, a Dilworth School survivors vlog. Well, the day everyone has been waiting for is finally here. The release of the Dilworth Independent Inquiry Report. Let's have a look at the press release by the inquirers.
And with my co-inquirer Frances Joychild, we have conducted the Dilworth Independent Inquiry and are releasing the report today. It's a report into historic abuse at Dilworth School in Auckland. Dilworth was established as a private boarding school for boys in 1906, and its purpose was to help boys from financially disadvantaged homes gain a good education, and students are not charged any fees. Many Dilworth students came to the school following family trauma or dysfunction, serious parental accident or illness, separation or divorce, and most lacked a father. The widespread historic abuse of students at Dilworth first came to public attention in 2020 following initial complaints to New Zealand Police. To date, one Dilworth volunteer and 12 former staff have been charged with various sexual abuse offences against Dilworth students, and 11 former staff have been convicted of sexual abuse. The Dilworth Trust Board commissioned an independent inquiry to review the nature and extent of sexual and serious physical abuse at Dilworth School of its students. And that report is to cover the abuse from 1950 to the 1st of July this year. And the purpose of the report was to find out how and why that abuse happened, and to ensure that school policies are adequate to keep current and future students safe from abuse. The terms of reference for the inquiry required us to make findings under 4 broad headings: the nature and extent of sexual and serious physical abuse, the factors that caused or contributed to that abuse, the acts and omissions of the school, its trustees, officers and staff in responding to or addressing complaints of abuse, and the adequacy of the policies and procedures in place at the school today to prevent any future abuse. Frances and I have prepared a very thorough and well-informed report, and we want to place on public record our sincere thanks to all those who gave information to us. And we hope that this report will bring closure to the men who have been abused at the school and to their families. We've spoken with 175 former students and 100 former staff and trustees or people who were closely associated with the school. During the period of review, we've been told by the school that the school roll totalled 4,693 students. So our report doesn't speak to the experiences of the other students who attended Dilworth who didn't give us information. And we do know that there were many caring, talented and capable teachers. Some we have spoken to, and others we've heard about. We also know that many students built successful careers, lives and families after leaving Dilworth, and feel a huge debt to their school. However, not all former Dilworth students enjoyed that positive experience. And regrettably, the report we are releasing today is a catalogue of damage and injustice. Of the 171 former students who provided information to the inquiry about sexual abuse, 126 reported being sexually abused. We also know of a further 49 boys who were sexually abused by Dilworth staff or volunteers, making a total of 175. Sadly, we believe that this number of 175 is likely to be much higher. The New Zealand Police estimate 233 student victims. In our report, we have found that sexual abuse was consistently committed at Dilworth from the mid-1950s until the end of 2005, peaking between the 1970s and the 1990s. A full range of sexual abuse was reported, from sending explicit sexual messages to rape. Students were extensively groomed and abused by Dilworth tutors, housemasters, chaplains, teachers, Scout volunteers, staff friends and associates, and even friends of friends. Grooming and abuse occurred during religious teaching, pastoral care, choir practices, leisure time at boarding houses, classroom teaching, extracurricular activities, and at off-site camps. Grooming also taught some students as they matured how to use younger ones for sexual purposes, and the inquiry heard of significant student-on-student abuse. Of the 159 former Dilworth students who provided information about physical abuse, 134 reported having been seriously physically abused there. There are two broad categories of this reported abuse. The first was bullying, which was mostly perpetrated by older, larger, or otherwise more powerful students. The other entailed physical assaults on students by house tutors, housemasters, and teachers, including the excessive use of caning as a form of punishment. I'm going to hand over now to my co-inquirer, Francis.
Besides looking at the nature and extent of abuse, we had to inquire as to why it happened and what were the causative factors. So we identified several broad causative factors. There were serious failings in school leadership and board governance. Other factors included the presence of staff who sexually abused students, the vulnerability of the particular Dilworth boys, parental disempowerment, and a harsh school environment and culture. And up to 2018, complaints of sexual abuse were made, and in most instances they were dismissed without investigation and not reported to the board. The vast majority of those that were reported to the board were handled in a seriously deficient manner. Almost without exception, support was not provided to the abused students. Further, the school and board failed to investigate complaints properly or at all, failed to determine if other students had been abused by the staff member, failed to report abuse to the police or education authorities, and failed to develop a complaints policy, even when advised to do so by its own lawyer and when the Department of Education had issued guidelines to schools to do so. Abusing staff were allowed to resign, often with excellent references that enabled them to gain employment at other schools. Most board members were unaware that as a private school, Dilworth was very lightly regulated. Consequently, the lack of proper policies and procedures to protect student safety went unchallenged for decades, and there was very limited professional oversight of the performance of the school and its leadership. There was a lack of staff vetting, supervision or training, particularly in the boarding houses. The lack of systems in place to protect children had damaging and long-lasting consequences for them. The ongoing cloak of silence and the determination to protect the school's reputation allowed the abuse to continue. At Dilworth today, those causative factors are being addressed and fundamental culture change is underway. The work the school has done in recent years is commendable, but more work is needed, and continuous attention will be vital to ensure the change is sustained. In responding to the terms of reference for the inquiry, we have grouped the recommendations into 9 broad categories. And the topics are, firstly, transforming board governance, then ensuring professional oversight of the school performance, assisting recovery from abuse, maintaining and enhancing student safety, considering the future direction of the school, improving school systems, vetting, supervising, developing and training staff, supporting students and staff after publication of the inquiry report, and developing positive external relationships, particularly with the police. We know that our report will be distressing for the Dilworth community at large, but it's important that there is a clear and honest account of what happened. The inquiry heard from men who said their experiences at Dilworth led to shattered and broken periods in their lives. These men have experienced addictions, mental health illnesses, and some have isolated themselves completely from family, former friends, and their communities. Some were unable to start or sustain intimate partner relationships. Many felt they could not parent their children well, and sadly, many reported broken relationships with their mothers, who they blamed for sending them to Dilworth. The former students who spoke to the inquiry are courageous and determined. They share a strong desire to ensure this type of abuse never happens again. The work of the inquiry ends today, but it's not the end for the former students, their families, Dilworth School, or the wider Dilworth community. We hope our recommendations can assist in fostering trust between former students and their school, and that Dilworth School can be returned to and restored to the model James Dilworth planned for, to provide boys with an excellent education that would equip them to become good and useful citizens. Thank you again to all those who assisted the Dilworth Independent inquiry.
So we'll take a few questions. Presumably you guys need them at the lectern.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, Francis.
James Sylvia.
Oh,
Hello, Michael Morrow.
Hello, Michael.
Your report was very detailed and appeared to show information which would portray a cover-up by school leaders to protect the perpetrators and silence the abuse that occurred. In your opinion, was there a cover-up?
we have described it as a cloak of silence, which was achieved by punishing children who reported abuse, failing to report perpetrators to the police, providing no support for those students. And in the context of the Dilworth School model, where there are no fee-paying parents, there were no parents there to support or to knock on the door and say what's happening. Parents were kept at arm's length from the school.
Was that deliberate, do you think?
It was certainly the outcome. I can't speak to whether it was deliberate or not.
Did you feel that the school board or those in leadership positions obstructed police?
Yes, we have found that quite clearly, yes. Or not so much obstructed as simply didn't report, and certainly didn't give full information when it was available.
Why?
I can't answer to that either.
But do you think it was because there was a deliberate attempt to cover up what was happening and protect the school's name?
We have certainly found that the protection of the school's reputation was a primary focus for boards over the years. Francis, you should be up here too. I'm not going to do all of this on my own.
Done very well.
What has been the reaction from the victims when you showed them the outcome of your inquiry?
Well, I can't fully answer that, but the ones we've spoken to today, and there are two at least here today in this room, have been relieved, I think. Would that be fair enough? That there's a very full account of what has happened over many decades now available, because I'm pretty sure they had no idea of the extent of the abuse, and I think that must be helpful to them to know that they weren't the only ones.
What was the most challenging part for both of you in
Answer
undertaking?
that.
Oh, it was a hard inquiry, of course. It wasn't as hard as what the men have gone through for years, but it was hard listening to the stories. However, both Dame Sylvia and I have worked on difficult topics in our career many times, and we have a range of strategies to protect ourselves and support ourselves through it.
Francis, as a lawyer, do you think that there's aspects in the report which would point to criminal negligence? Do you think there is scope for police to be investigating further and laying charges?
Look, I'm sure the police are investigating, you know, they have been investigating all along, but it's not for us to say that. It's for other lawyers to look at the report and draw their own conclusions.
And do you have an opinion, and sorry to return to this question, but it's quite important because this is what survivors have been telling us for years, is that there was a concerted, organised cover-up, a cloak of silence. Dame Sylvia said, I mean, in your opinion, was there a cover-up?
Of the abuse? Well, there was a whole systemic way in which the school operated, which had the result that nothing came out. That's certainly the case. Students were silenced. Teachers were allowed to go on and teach elsewhere. The school board was very concerned for its reputation. Offending teachers was treated only as a employment matter, and the whole perspective of the school was not addressed. So I guess it's for you to draw the conclusions from that. We've called it a cloak of silence, and we have also said there was a strong motivation throughout to protect the reputation of the school, and we've given you examples of why that was in the report.
What was the most, I mean, one of the more troubling aspects of the report, in my opinion, was the fact that children were, in some cases, shared between teachers for the purposes of sexual abuse. How would you
No, there was also some.
describe that finding?
Well,
in terms of
You
you know,
answer.
the interviews that you conducted and finding that out, how do you feel about that personally?
Well, we pretty much the way you would think about it, I imagine. It's a real indictment on the school for allowing that abuse upon abuse to occur.
deeply shocking.
Very young children too.
What's the school's response been to your report? I imagine that they saw it before it was released just now. What's their response been?
I just think you might say they've had a robust response to it, yes.
I think they've advised they're going to consider their response. So, but they do acknowledge that the abuse happened, which is important, and that it wasn't the fault of the students. And we think that's two very important statements that they have made.
You talk in your recommendations about the essentially changes to the board. Just to be very clear, so you're saying that the board as it is right now in 2023 is not fit for purpose, right?
We believe it should be much more diverse than it is, that its purpose, ever since the trust was established, has been to grow and nurture the assets and income, but the main purpose of a school board has not been present, so they certainly need to attend to that. No more questions.
Another question. The report said friends of friends were involved. Did you find that anybody was paying a teacher or a volunteer to use these boys?
Not to our knowledge, no. These were people who were friends of teachers or other personnel at the school and who were part of the friendship group. We have no information on that.
They had very easy access to deal with boys. Friends of friends. There was just no safety protections in place at all.
You were just asked before about yourselves coping with investigations. And you were saying you have strategies in place to deal with investigations like this, but where does this one rate in terms of how hard it has been, in terms of the difficulty of all those interviews and the stories you've been hearing? Where is it on the scale of the investigations that you have done?
Well, the EQC inquiry was difficult, but not as difficult as this. There were many traumatised people in that, and that's the most recent major inquiry I've done. The difficulty is when, as we are both lawyers, we have a certain job to do to gain correct and well-tested information, and at the same time make sure that the person who's giving this information is well looked after. And we had a really good team of wellness support to help with that. So we've both done a lot of this sort of work, and I don't think that. Well, I hope that the survivors didn't feel more traumatised. That's always a danger. But it's the sort of these are the sorts of stories they live with you forever.
The school has declined to comment thus far and said it may make a statement further down the track. Do you feel this is an appropriate response?
Oh, that's for the school to decide. I would think that they need time to really assess the full impact of the report and to deal with the many issues that they'll have to cope with, particularly supporting former students. It'll probably take them time to come to terms with all of that.
How long have they had the report for?
Less than a week.
Yeah, 5 days.
Because as you said, the cone of silence.
Yes. Well, it's for the our inquiry finishes now, but there's a lot of survivors out there, and it's for them to work with the school. And one of our recommendations is that the school immediately works with survivors to build that bridge and move forward on the recommendations. So we're very hopeful that that will happen.
Do your recommendations have an equal weight, or are there one or two or a few that you think need to be in as soon as possible, or do they all need to be in as soon as possible?
The trust board?
Yeah.
I think we would both feel that a review of the governance of the school is a very important issue, and that's the trust board itself. There are many areas there where it's going to be very difficult to achieve change, but leadership, of course, comes from the governance, from the trust board, and without that strong leadership, it'll be very difficult for the school to change course after so many years.
The other thing I would say is, I think, recommendation 3, unless the school works with the abused old boys and moves forward, it's going to be blighted forever by this scandal. So it must immediately start to build the bridges. There's been a real division at the school now between those who had a great time at the school and achieved well in life and their careers, and those who were abused, and that the school has to come together as one, acknowledge the terrible suffering of many of its students and bring them along, or they must enable the abused students to bring them along on a healing journey that's got to be unique to Dilworth. That is vital for the school's ongoing reputation.
Let's see what TV3 had to say about the inquiry report.
Dilworth is New Zealand's wealthiest school and sold itself as a haven for vulnerable students from broken homes.
But a damning 500-page report into sexual abuse there has laid bare how for decades the Auckland School's leaders and staff betrayed those vulnerable students and the families who sent them there. Investigations correspondent Michael Morra is with us now for more on this. Michael.
Yeah, well, guys, this report states that sexual abuse was committed consistently at Dilworth from the 1950s right through until 2005. Investigators say 175 former students reported being sexually abused, but the report said the real number could be higher. Some students were shared among staff for the purpose of sexually abusing them. School leaders failed to investigate complaints against staff, obstructed police and allowed perpetrators to resign, and then lied about their sudden departures. Neil Harding has been engaged in a years-long struggle to get the truth. Today, this report exposed in all its horror what really went on at Dilworth.
The last thing they've wanted is the truth to come out, and the truth is out. And this is our day of reckoning.
The report we are releasing today is a catalogue of damage and injustice.
Students were sexually abused by school leaders, including tutors, housemasters, chaplains, teachers, volunteers and friends of staff. Grooming and abuse of students taught them how to assault others. The school board allowed offenders to resign, some getting payouts in the process. The community was not told the truth about staff when they suddenly departed, and the board offered limited assistance to police despite knowing staff had pertinent information.
When you have a trust board that is covering up abuse, the school is not safe.
The inquiry report says there was collusion among abusers and that students were shared between staff. Neil Harding experienced that. He says former housemaster Rex McIntosh sent him to scoutmaster and convicted sex offender Ian Wilson. The report states McIntosh asked Wilson if he had got his own boy yet. When Wilson said no, McIntosh said he'd sought it out for him. But what's worse than that, in Harding's view, is the way the abuse continued.
Has Dilworth been more concerned about reputation and money than the safety of children?
Yes, and that's the problem. This is worse than anything that the pedophiles did. This is bigger. They perpetuated the environment for a pedophile farm.
Important files on another sex offender, school chaplain Peter Taylor, were accidentally destroyed.
I do not believe that could ever be an accident. You just don't destroy school files.
Complaints were routinely ignored. Those who spoke up were punished. This was against a backdrop of extreme violence. The sexual assaults on Byron Lennon turned him to drugs and booze.
My alcohol and drug addiction was rampant. This is for years.
He ended up in a gang in Sydney and eventually in jail.
How long did you spend in jail in Aussie?
So I spent 2 years, 6 months in Silverwater.
He was deported back here in 2016. Now 2 years clean, he's pleased to see the report, but he's not convinced by Dilworth's apology and talk of transformation.
It's all a bit late to say an apology now, just because they've been caught out. But I hope that now and in the future Dilworth puts in place things to establish like a safe school.
And he urges others who are suffering in silence not to give up.
I just want the Dilworth boys to know that they're not alone.
If the time feels right, come and stand with us.
The school was founded in 1906 by farmer James Dilworth to help the disadvantaged. Survivors say if he was still around, he'd be horrified.
So, Michael, what has Dilworth School had to say?
Yeah, well, Yannicka, we did request interviews with both the current headmaster and the chair of the board, but this was declined, which was surprising because this report is probably one of the worst I've ever read in my career, to be honest. Instead, we were sent a statement from Aaron Snodgrass, the board chair, he apologised to former students, acknowledged their courage for speaking up, and said Dilworth is focused on student safety in all aspects of its work. Now, the report made 19 recommendations, one of which called for a total transformation of the Dilworth board. So essentially a massive overhaul. The school says it will consider these recommendations. Now, people like Neil Harding say that is not good enough, and he's hoping that further criminal charges will come about as a result of the information and evidence gathered in this report.
Investigations correspondent Michael Morrow, tēnā koe.
Let's have a look at what One News had to say about the inquiry report.
Assault scandals in a New Zealand school has finally been lifted. This is how many boys are found to have been abused at Auckland's Dilworth School, 175, and it's believed that number's likely to be higher. An independent inquiry led by Dame Sylvia Cartwright engaged with 681 people to produce its final report. It's found the school suppressed abuse, silenced victims and enabled the sex criminals. Dilworth was established in the early 1900s to provide an education for underprivileged boys to give them a better future. But instead, many were abused. Offending happened under former headmasters dating back to 1950, the most recent allegation in 2018. In each era of the school's leadership, complaints were made, but nothing changed. Instead, the inquiries found Dilworth's response to sex crimes was driven by a desire to protect its reputation and finances, as Kim Baker-Wilson reports.
The country's richest school, what was supposed to be a safe haven for these boys.
These are the sorts of stories they live with you forever.
Shocking abuse over more than 7 decades, kept hidden.
We've called it a cloak of silence, and we've also said there was a strong motivation throughout to protect the reputation of the school.
Their findings span more than 500 pages, a catalogue of failings and injustice and damaged lives.
It's a damning indictment of Dilworth, its management, its practices.
And it's confirmation of what survivors have been saying for years.
The abuse was horrific, horrific abuse.
He was here today to finally and formally hear these words.
The school and board failed to investigate complaints properly or at all, failed to determine if other students had been abused by the staff member, failed to report abuse to the police or education authorities.
If you can stomach reading the report, it pretty much describes my Dilworth experience.
And the experience of so many others. The independent inquiry found a kind of sex ring was operating, highlighting several staff members working together to prey on students.
It's a real indictment on the school for allowing that abuse upon abuse to occur.
The abuse stretching from explicit messages to much, much worse.
I went back there recently with a friend who was raped on the altar of the chapel.
Students groomed and abused
by Dilworth tutors, housemasters, chaplains, teachers, scout volunteers, staff friends.
Over 73 long and painful years.
Well over 20 of these boys have committed suicide. Many have had lifelong issues.
It needs to contact and collaborate with survivors and their representatives to come up with a redress scheme that is fit for purpose for the boys, that is not governed by money.
11 men have been convicted. In early cases, the school fought to suppress its name and often held police at bay. The inquiry finding the school long put itself ahead of its students.
Well, there was a whole systemic way in which the school operated, which had the result that nothing came out. That's certainly the case. Students were silenced, teachers were allowed to go on and teach elsewhere.
Some even left with glowing references. Many students were punished for raising complaints.
If they hadn't have caned boys that had reported my pedophiles before me, then I wouldn't have been abused.
The inquiries made 19 recommendations, key among them to reform the Trust Board.
Unless the school works with the abused old boys and moves forward, it's going to be blighted forever by this scandal.
Just don't be by yourself today.
On a day they've waited so long for.
And Kim is with us live now. How's the school responded to the findings, Kim?
Well, the board has had those findings for almost a week. No interviews were given today, but it has released a statement with no thoughts on any of those 19 recommendations that it has been given. But it does make a promise that it will look at this report and its findings and look at them with care and consideration. It says this report has been unsparingly honest. We did ask the inquirers today what they thought their most important recommendation is, and they said it's one centering on a review of the governance of the school. They say that without good leadership here, it will be very hard for this very old school to change the course that it has been on. The people in our story, though, are very clear about what they want to see, and that is for the current board chairperson to go. They say it is time for him to leave. They say it's also time for police to look at charging people who kept up that cloak of silence, who kept this abuse hidden and secret for so many decades. We again asked the inquirers if that is something they think should happen. They told us that is up for others to decide.
Tēnā koe, Kim. Thank you very much for that.
All I can say is the realism of having what we believe confirmed by professionals is confronting, upsetting, disgusting and disappointing. But it needed to be done to bring about acknowledgement of what has happened, which hopefully brings about positive change and meaningful redress, so survivors can move on and hopefully heal. What I thought was amazing was the comment by Frances Joychild. Let me replay that.
Unless the school works with the abused old boys and moves forward, it's going to be blighted forever by this scandal. So it must immediately start to build the bridges. There's been a real division at the school now between those who had a great time at the school and achieved well in life and their careers, and those who were abused, and that the school has to come together as one, acknowledge the terrible suffering of many of its students and bring them along, or the student, that must enable the abused students to bring them along on a healing journey that's got to be unique to Dilworth. That is vital for the school's ongoing reputation.
Frances really hit the nail on the head with that statement. What will be interesting to see is if that statement falls on deaf ears. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the inquiry team for all its hard work in leaving no rock unturned and getting to the truth. The survivors thank you. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel so I can let you know about the next episode.
If Isabella Dilworth was alive today, should be.